Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
Hello and welcome to this workshop, this St. Mary's University Writing Center workshop on writing in the arts. What this workshop will cover, as indicated in the title, is what are specific elements to writing in the arts, what makes writing in the arts different to writing in other disciplines. We will briefly talk about common obstacles to critical thinking. There will be a practical example. We will look at an Old Spice commercial and how we can apply critical thinking to that commercial when analyzing this commercial. And we'll, last but not least, also briefly talk about how to tackle long assignments, long essays. Before we get started, a good thing to think about at the beginning is, what do we mean when we say writing in the arts? What disciplines are generally included or involved when we think about writing in the arts? Generally speaking, the disciplines that usually are under the umbrella of the arts, a different word for arts would be humanities, are the disciplines of philosophy, modern language and classics, English, history, sociology, anthropology, women and gender studies, social sciences, etc. This, of course, is not an exclusive list. Depending on the university that you're studying at, you might find some disciplines situated within the arts and the humanities. Sometimes you might find the disciplines situated within the sciences, depending on where they are, where their emphasis lies, especially if there's a discipline that broaches both areas, has an element that's situated within the humanities and an element that's situated within the sciences. For example, geography or environmental studies or psychology, classic disciplines that broach both elements to them. Also, sometimes disciplines might split into smaller disciplines. For example, sociology at St. Mary's has split to some degree, and now you've got a social justice department and a sociology department, while not too long ago there was one department that had both elements to them. What distinguishes writing in the arts from other disciplines, we can generally make distinctions between what the arts focus on, the research focuses on, and what constitutes the content of arts in contrast to business and science. When we're looking at focus, and before we look at focus, perhaps a quick side point about the background illustration here. We've got two people facing each other and communicating with each other, as indicated by these arrows and these wheels that reflect representations of their brains, if you like. And the way I would interpret this illustration is that you have two people communicating with each other, they're talking to each other. And I think that's a very apt illustration when we think about what constitutes the arts, or what is especially relevant when thinking about the arts and the humanities. As the term indicates, humanities investigate human activity, human nature, various different kinds of thought processes, etc. This is quite aptly illustrated in this depiction here. You have two people communicating with each other. In the arts, you might also have one person communicating with themselves. They might think about their own ideas, their own attitudes towards their surroundings. So there could be a self-reflective component as well. But essentially, in the arts, you've got a very strong dialogic component. So you're in conversation with other people in order to identify and find out about what constitutes human nature, what makes us human. But to go back to the focus, what is distinctive about the arts, and we'll be looking at this again a little bit later, is critical thinking. Critical thinking essentially means that you're basing decisions on evidence that can be verified, not on what your beliefs might be, what you feel like, but on evidence that is externally visible, evidence that you can show to somebody else and to try to convince somebody else with. Okay, so it's evidence-based thinking, and thinking that involves your critical faculties, your reason, right, your brains. Another element that's distinctive to the arts is that you assert individual opinions. So your viewpoint, your understanding of a subject matter is important. So you'll be often asked, what do you think about this issue? It's not what somebody else might be thinking and repeating somebody else has thought, has stated regarding an issue, but your views are important, right? Formulating your own viewpoints and defending them is what is distinctive about the art. You're also part of a larger conversation. So of a group of people, you align yourself with different kinds of traditions of thinking, and also these traditions of thinking might broach the disciplinary boundaries that that your discipline might be situated within. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. And essentially, what this element of critical thinking and asserting your individual opinions drives towards to is creating viewpoints that are persuasive, arguments that are persuasive and that are informed. Okay, so the ideas that you have by going through different kinds of thought processes, evidence-based, you transform your initial opinion perhaps, and transform this initial opinion, initial view you might have had about a particular subject matter, and create an informed, persuasive argument that you can then convince others of. When we're thinking of research in the arts and the humanities, you generally deal with narratives. The narratives here is is used generically. It's not that it's a story, but it's stories as people tell each other different kinds of stories, and stories tend to be at the center of what the arts investigates. So if you're thinking of history, the way history is written down, or sociology to some degree, you're investigating stories that people tell themselves about themselves or each other, about their group, etc. And this is what is in many ways at the core of the humanities. And there's, according to the discipline that you're in, you'll apply different kinds of theories to investigate these narratives, these stories. If you're in literary studies, you will investigate and examine novels, poetry. In other disciplines, and in literature studies, of course, we'll look at articles, different longer studies, perhaps monographs, but much of what you'll be investigating, what you'll be looking at, it can be perhaps distilled to some degree into this generic form of narrative. Different kinds of stories that might be framed in different ways, but essentially stories that we tell ourselves and each other about who we are. What you take away from these kinds of texts and stories is specific ideas and arguments that you will then investigate and base your argument on. As indicated before, you might find yourself at the boundaries of disciplines. So if you're in literary studies, you might draw from different disciplines. You might draw from history, you might draw from sociology, you might draw from philosophy, and different theories that have originated within these disciplines to illuminate something specific about the text that you want to investigate. In terms of citation styles that you will be using in the arts, most commonly you'll find MLA and Chicago, but APA is also fairly common, and another workshop talks about these different citation styles. When we think of content, as mentioned earlier already, there's a very strong personal component to what constitutes the core of these investigations, namely your individual viewpoints, your individual interpretation of a particular issue, of a novel, of a story, of a narrative, or a piece of evidence, historical evidence that you find carries a lot of weight. So a personal component is very strong in the arts. Another thing that's important is to be able to argue both sides, and both sides does not necessarily mean that you need to weigh the pros and cons. Of course, this is that features there as well. But in terms of an argument, an argument tends to be stronger if you also anticipate criticism or critique of the argument that you're putting forth, right? So in philosophical terms, you use the terms hypothesis and an antithesis, so a counter argument, and you try to bring those two together in a synthesis, which then is the final distilled and informed way that you present your argument, trying to come up with a conclusion. In the arts, you generally don't have any wrong answers. It's not the way that you might work in the sciences. Something's either true or false, or right or wrong. In the arts, much of the essays you'll be writing, much of the conversations you'll be having are conversations on subject positions and defending particular arguments. So it's not whether something is right or wrong, but rather whether something is convincing and believable, evidence-based, etc. Right? A lot will depend on the kinds of sources that your argument is based on. This leads to the last point, namely that there is no absolute truth in the arts or in the humanities themselves. Of course, there are preferences, but there's no like as the way you might have in the science, a truth or axioms that cannot be falsified because they're true. In the art, everything is negotiable, and what is true now, or what is considered to be true in inverted commas, or a convincing argument might not be a convincing argument a few years later or a few decades down the line. So moving on to the next part, namely different obstacles to critical thinking. The first subcategory are based on our basic human limitations. So we as humans have limitations that we have to acknowledge when we interact with our surroundings. The first one, of course, is perception. Our sense perception, we can only interact with the world through the senses that we have. So the way we see things, the way we feel things, the way we taste and smell things, etc. Another element that constitutes a limitation is what is referred to as a confirmation bias, that we are quite comfortable in, or we actively seek information that confirms our established views rather than trying to falsify our views, right? It's a basic limitation. That's the way we're wired. Another basic human limitation is that we do not know a lot of things. And if we do not know something, it's very difficult to investigate our lack of knowledge and critique what we think that we know from a perspective or from a place that we don't know just yet. We are not aware of, that we are ignorant about. The last element of basic human limitations is personal prejudice, and this refers to different kinds of socializations. We're socialized. Every one of us is socialized in different kinds of ways, and based on our socializations, we consider certain things to be true, certain things to be facts, certain things to be right, certain things to be wrong. And in extreme cases, there are certain kinds of prejudices that emanate out of these different kinds of socializations, right? What we consider to be normal, and we tell each other stories in very generalized ways about each other. And specificities, of course, are always very different, but personal prejudices that are based on our different kinds of socializations can also constitute very strong limitations to critical thinking, because we'd have to break through these, this layer of comfort we've created around ourselves as we grow up. Moving on to the next part then, obstacles to critical thinking based on logic. So there's different kinds of logics that our arguments might be based on or can be based on, and some of these logics might be somewhat faulty. The first example would be a false analogy, only because an example would be the watchmaker argument. It's commonly used in theology to some degree and in social studies, only because one thing is similar in one way doesn't necessarily mean that it's similar in another way. The watchmaker argument refers to the intricate way that a watch is put together, so the wheels that are perfectly attuned in order to keep time, etc. Can be compared to nature, the way nature, the world works. Everything seems to be quite perfectly tuned, right? Everything is in perfect order to some degree. So there's an analogy there. The false analogy would then be the watch was made by a watchmaker, and by comparison then, by analogy, the world was made by some creator. So you're jumping something that's quite, to some degree, specifically comparable, but then the kind of conclusion to draw from that is where the logic breaks down. The next faulty logic perhaps would be the difference between correlation and causation. Correlation indicates a strong connection between two subjects, two phenomena. Causation means there's a cause and effect relationship. Sometimes they're confused, but there's a difference between these terms. Begging the question means that you presented an argument while at the same time also presenting the solution to this argument, or presenting a problem, but also presenting a solution to the problem. So we're not really asking a question in the first place, right? For example, we could say this is extremely expensive because it has such a high price. There's not much offered in terms of evidence here. Slippery slope would be an argument that assumes that the next step would be extremely bad, a worst case scenario. So it's from one example, you're hypothesizing that the next step, the next logical step would be disaster in some ways, right? So and you're using that particular argument, the particular logic to discredit a particular viewpoint. For example, a child wants to decide what the family has for dinner, and the person who does not agree with that, the child having that kind of power, inverted commas, would say, well, we cannot have the child decide what we'll have for dinner, because the next thing they'll decide is where they go to school, or where we go on holiday, or whether we should buy a television or not, or what have you, right? So they're not connected. It's a bit of a slippery. So of course these are not really worst case scenarios, but generally speaking, that's what slippery slope is all about. And then the last example here of faulty logic is a strawman argument. And essentially here you're misrepresenting and oversimplifying a complex subject matter in order to make it easy to attack. We're all familiar with that term. No example needed here. When we move on to the next element of obstacles of critical thinking, namely the way that language can be used to prevent us from thinking critically about the subject matter, is by employing different kinds of expressions. Assuring expression, everyone knows that. Okay, if everyone knows that, maybe I should agree with that as well, right? Puts it at peace. Judgmental language, using different kinds of adjectives to make it more difficult to critique or question the assumptions or the conclusions that another speaker might make. So if you use the terminology, for example, a vicious attack, makes it quite difficult to argue that perhaps there was no attack because it's already a vicious attack, or this attack might not have been vicious, that this might have been there might be self-defense involved in that, or what have you, right? So by using judgmental language, you make it more difficult to critique a particular subject point. And if you're using that language yourself, it makes it very difficult to be self-reflective about the assumptions that underlie your viewpoints here. Another example would be euphemisms. Euphemisms are just using terminology to disguise the reality of various phenomena. For example, collateral damage. Familiar with that term, perhaps, in the 21st century now, coming out of these many different kinds of wars in the first few decades of the 21st century. So collateral damage would refer to the death and the killing of innocent bystanders in various kinds of violent altercations, in wars or attacks, right? Collateral damage, they weren't meant to be killed, but they are killed. But rather than saying that we've killed innocent people, the term collateral damage disguises that. Or another example, economical with the truth. So it's easy to say somebody is economical with the truth, or they change their views every now and then, or rather than saying that they might be lying. Another example here would be weasel words. So you kind of use different kinds of words to throw your interlocutor, the person that you're debating with, off in some ways. So you say, some say that, it's the opinion of many, again, similar to assuring expression to some degree, but here using authoritative language in order to disguise maybe the fact that you don't really know what you're talking about. For example, you could say astrophysicists argue that extraterrestrials have already visited Earth, right? But just making the claim that astrophysicists make the claim, or there's evidence, and by using the term astrophysicist, you might sound more authoritative than you actually are. The last element, obstacles to critical thinking, are to do with social and psychological effects. And in many ways, that takes us back to the kinds of prejudices which are socially conditioned. So we grow up in a society, and by growing up in a society, a group of people, we're conditioned to see the world in certain kinds of ways. And this leads to obstacles to critical thinking based on our social and psychological upbringing. For example, you might create a false dilemma. An example here, either you support the war or you hate democracy. So in an environment where supporting the war is the right thing to do, this might sound like a good argument, right? But for somebody who is not didn't grow up within that space, supporting the war and hating democracy are not things that are really connected with one another. Another example would be appeal to authority. So somebody who grew up religiously might make the claim the church says that homosexuality is wrong, so it must be. For somebody who was not raised that way, does not probably make an awful lot of sense, because what authority does the church have to decide whether homosexuality is right or wrong? Okay, so appeal to authority. Within a particular group, the church might have a strong authority. For another group, the church might not have any authority whatsoever. Another aspect would be emotional appeals. So you don't want to date to think, you don't want your date to think that you have bad breath, do you? So it's again the way you want to come across and the way you're conditioned within a group or society to present yourself on your first date. So that's a big no-no. So an appeal to emotion to change your action for you, for example. And the last example here is wishful thinking. So somebody grew up in Canada might subscribe to this statement: Canada is the greatest place in the world. Who couldn't love us? Again, wishful thinking. Somebody growing up in another part of the world might be somewhat critical of that statement, or more critical of that statement perhaps, than someone growing up within a group and not having been in contact or not having had the opportunity and the chance to reflect their place in the world within Canada and outside of Canada. Okay, so these are just a very succinct, very brief, to some degree rushed overview of different kinds of obstacles to critical thinking that you can employ, that you might be worthwhile to think about and be cognizant of, to be aware of when engaging with the subject matter. What we'll do next, we'll move on to a practical application of that. So we'll watch a quick video. You've seen it probably before already, an Old Spice commercial, and we'll play this twice, and then we'll talk about the commercial very briefly. Already an Old Spice commercial, and we'll play this twice, and then we'll talk about the commercial screen. Okay, here you go.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamond. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse. Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamond. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
Okay, in case you've had difficulties watching this video, you can see the link below here, below this illustration, and you can watch it before we move on to the next element of this workshop. When analyzing this video, hopefully you've taken notes while watching this video. You can of course watch it again. When analyzing this video, you can think about what different kinds of obstacles to critical thinking can you identify here. Remember, this is a commercial, so commercials are there to make us buy something which we would not normally perhaps think of buying. So how is this product presented in ways that entices it to us as consumers to purchase this product? Perhaps thinking about it in terms of how is the central character here, former football player Isaiah Mustafa, represented here in different ways, moving from the shower out into a boat, up into a horse, etc. What role do diamonds play here that take us to the favorite event, the yacht, and what have you? What kind of roles do they play? What role does the language play? Kind of look at me, look at your partner on the sofa, etc. So kind of what role does language play in order to convince us to buy this particular project, right? So there's many different things you could think about and examine this commercial here. What we'll do next is we will look at 3 different kinds of texts that examine this commercial. You can find them by the Patrick Power Library. The third one, the academic journal article, you can find by the Patrick Power Library. The first two short essays and analyses are taken from the internet. You've got the web link below. So what we'll look at briefly is the introductory paragraphs in an abbreviated form, and how these three different authors present their case in the introduction. And we'll briefly talk about what might be good about it, what could perhaps be improved. Okay, if we look at the first essay, I'm just going to read it out here by Matthew Tse. Marketing expert Paul Arden once said about advertising, there are rules in advertising, and those rules are self-imposed by the client companies because they don't want their products to be seen as dishonest. A quote by Paul Arden from Brainy Quote. Source Brainy Quote perhaps is not the best kind of source. Maybe you want to use a different source here. In highly, so there's an ellipsis, so there's elements that I've left out here. In highly visual culture, every visual portion of an advertisement matters. While most conventional commercials will feature the utility and function of a product service, some marketing agencies have stepped outside the standard format to produce something wildly different. Creative risks may pay off, but then again, they might not. This essay will explore and analyze the visual aspect of one commercial that has paid off. Weed and Kennedy is the man your man could smell like for Old Spice. Media theorists such as Lazarsfeld and Merton will supplement this essay with the information regarding mass media, standard conferral theory, and impact upon popular taste. Okay, you can read this article, it's available online, very short. What I want us to focus on here is how this introduction is structured and how it drives towards the main idea, which is now highlighted in red. So this essay will explore and analyze the following issues using these theories. Right? By this short analysis starts out by a somewhat general statement about advertising, right? The different kinds of rules that are imposed. It's maybe the connection is not immediately kind of apparent, how the opening of this analysis connects to the specific focus of the analysis here. So that could be improved perhaps to some degree. When we look at the focus that's highlighted now in red, it's all fairly general, right? If you're not familiar with Lazarsfeld and Merton and what their theories regarding mass media, status conferral theory, and impact upon popular taste, you would not really know what this is about, right? So could be fleshed out a little more, made a little more specific to make the presentation, I think, more engaging and also easier to follow by a reader. Right? If you look at the next example, another student essay by Anna Canova starts very differently. So, hello ladies, either smoothly stated by a handsome man approaching in a bar or tauntingly shouted out of the window of a speeding car full of teenage guys. This common statement, whether out of enchantment or disgust, immediately grabs the attention of many women. Again, an ellipses here. The Old Spice team discovered that in 2010, just about 60% of all body wash purchases were by women. So the wives and girlfriends in society were the ones selecting which body wash their men use. So although Old Spice is endorsing a men's body wash, the central persuasion motive was to appeal to the women audience as well as men, to spark significant brand appeal from a wide range of viewers. With the spark of sex appeal and sprinkling of humor in the form of pathos, foundation of many societal gender-oriented commonplaces, construction of the women audience, as well as the appropriate use of kairos, this Old Spice commercial works to effectively persuade the viewing audience. Again, so the focus and mapping scheme of where the argument is laid out is again highlighted in red here. If we compare this to the previous example, this is more detailed, without knowing, and if we can get a sense of what this argument, the different kinds of aspects this audience will be based on. It's also situated more differently, right? It gives us a bit more of a backstory so we can understand, okay, the Old Spice, what is the rationale behind this commercial? Why was it put together the way it was put together? Who is the audience? So there's two kinds of audiences. One is male, the other one is female, etc. And this also then connects quite well to the specific focus of this essay, namely why does this commercial work so well? Why is it so persuasive? Because of these various aspects that are analyzed here. Look at the third example here. This is a journal article by two academics, Barber and Bridges. It again starts similar to the previous essay. So Isaiah Mustafa, shirtless, rises from a bubble bath on the white foam horse to spread the word, make sure your man smells like a man. This slogan appears at the bottom of the page, implying there is indeed such a thing as a manly scent. Again, an ellipsis here. All of these advertisements proceed from the assumption that masculinity is naturally at odds with anything even vaguely associated with women, like body wash, salad, or yogurt. Satirical masculinity produces a set of facetious cultural scripts that bridge the divide to create a new consumer base that man up to purchase otherwise feminine products. Again, an ellipsis here. So that's something that I haven't included here. It's worthwhile to ask whether these satirical representations of masculinity are indeed subversive by making outdated cultural ideals comical, or whether they help to reproduce the very forms of inequality they seem to mock. By analyzing 3 popular advertising campaigns in the satirical masculinity genre, we connect a cultural phenomenon to the emerging theory of hybrid masculinities, which considers shifting definitions of manhood in terms of their larger consequences for equality. So compared to the previous 2 essays, this essay is a bit larger in scale. It doesn't focus exclusively on one commercial, but it compares different commercials, different advertisements. So it also has a shift here. The first 2 looked at a specific commercial. This one here looks at advertisements, right? Not video, but images. But nonetheless, what you can identify here as well, it starts very specifically with a specific kind of focus to draw the reader in, and then it moves quite smoothly from that initial observation to different kinds of theories. So this initial observation is analyzed, as being an example of satirical masculinity, a masculinity that is satirized, that's made fun of. Then it asks a larger question, which is now highlighted in red, whether this element of satirical masculinity is indeed critical of masculinity, or whether it actually helps reproduce the very forms of inequality that are associated with masculinity. And then they offer a different theory, hybrid masculinities, to analyze maybe what might be at stake in these different representations of masculinity in these different advertisements that they analyze. Okay, so these 3 essays are very different in focus to some degree. The first ones focus exclusively on one commercial, but they present their ideas, their argument very differently. The third one here, this academic article, is a bit larger in scale, but it's still very specific. You can get a good sense of what the general argument is about that these authors try to convince you of. So moving on to the last element of this presentation now, namely how to tackle long papers. In the arts, you'll be asked, and this what's again is something that's distinctive for the arts or the humanities, in contrast to business and sciences, where you might not write such long papers. You will write longer papers, but maybe not such long papers. And in arts, as you'll be writing in the arts. I've got here 2 illustrations. On the right-hand side, you've got the bound copy of a project from a few years back. It was a project when Iowa City was the City of Literature by UNESCO in 2010 or 11. A poet, namely Dave Morris, was asked, he was also there's a marathon poet, he does all these kinds of marathons, to write 100 poems for 100 days. In total, this was 10,000 poems, which are then put together in one book, right? Which you have the illustrations here on the right when this collection of poems was put together at the University of Iowa, I think. At the bottom here, you've got the scroll. It's referred to also as The Scroll. So it's John Carrick's novel On the Road, which was written initially on a 9-meter long scroll. Before it was in the 1950s, it was published in book form then in the late 1950s. Well, these are very long texts, differently formatted, differently printed, etc. But what to take away from that is what you can see here, that there's repetitions of forms. So on the left-hand side, we've got different kinds of pages. On the bottom, we've got one scroll, and you can clearly identify there's beginnings of a paragraph, there's an end of a paragraph, etc. So when thinking of writing long assignments, tackling long papers, a useful word to think of here is the word fractal, which is a noun. So it refers to a curve or geometric figure, each part of which has the same statistical character as the whole. When we apply this to writing essays, this means nothing but that a short essay can be expanded into a long essay just by replicating the same kinds of forms. So a short essay will have an introduction, various body paragraphs, and a conclusion. We can expand this short essay into a longer essay by subdividing these individual body parts, right? Body part 3, as you can see here, could be divided into another few sub body parts or sub paragraphs or subsections with their own conclusion. And each of these subsections could again be subdivided into a few subsections with their own conclusion, as is indicated here, right? So introduction, part 1, part 2, part 3, but part 3 again could be subdivided into part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 3 of this subdivision could again be subdivided into part 1, part 2, part 3 with their own conclusions. So by repeating the same kinds of form, you can structure a long essay in a way that's very easy to read for your reader, but it's also easier for you to put together by just creating a structure. You have the overall structure as the structure in mind, introduction to conclusion with very body paragraphs. By subdividing these individual body paragraphs, you can, in smaller sections, this will make it easier to think through this whole project. Right? So it's not as overwhelming as it might be, but just breaking into smaller, manageable bits. You've got an illustration here on the right-hand side of what this might look like. Of course, this is an illustration of an essay itself. We could also think of this as a very long essay with each of the layers indicated a different section, or each of these sections, each parts are indicated by where there's a bread layer, like somewhere in between, or like a tomato layer, or whatever this might be. Let's say if we go by the red. So each section is subdivided by a red, and you've got within these sections, you've got subsections with different kinds of layers, right? And if they're, but each of these layers are clearly identifiable. So for somebody who doesn't know how this burger was put together, by just looking at it, you can clearly identify the different kinds of layers. What was put where? When there's a narrative explaining why things were put there, there's also a rationale behind this to some degree. But what to take away from that is when tackling long papers, the best way to go about this is you already know how an essay is structured, how a short essay is structured, by just replicating the same kinds of forms and dividing the longer assignment into smaller assignment or smaller sections. It will become manageable for you as the creator of this piece, and also then for the consumer, for your reader to read the product that you've created. Okay, that's all from me from now. I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to meeting you in the Writing Center if you have any questions regarding writing and the arts. All right, bye.